The loudest room. The fight started over a dish. That's what I tell people when they ask what finally broke us. Not the relationship, not the friendship, not the marriage, but the version of me that believed winning an argument meant something. It started over a dish left in the sink, and within 4 minutes it had become a referendum on respect, on effort, on who loved whom more, and who had always loved less. By minute 7 we were excavating things from 2 years prior. By minute 10, one of us had walked out of the room and the other was standing in the kitchen, heart pounding, hands shaking slightly, completely alone, and absolutely certain of being right. I was right, by the way, about the dish, probably about several of the other things too, and it didn't matter even a little. That moment in the kitchen, the silence after the door closed, the adrenaline with nowhere to go, the hollow feeling of a victory that tasted like ash, that was the beginning of a question that would take me years to answer properly. Why do we fight the way we fight? Why do intelligent, well-meaning people who genuinely care about each other turn conversations into combat? And more urgently, is there another way? Not a softer way, not a way that requires you to become a pushover or swallow every grievance with a smile. A smarter way, a way that actually works. This audiobook is my answer to that question. What you're about to hear is not a collection of techniques for manipulating people into agreeing with you. It is not a guide to becoming the most agreeable person in every room, nor is it a manual for winning every argument by technicality or exhaustion. What this is, what I've spent years building, testing, breaking, and rebuilding, is a framework for something far more valuable than winning. It's a framework for being understood, for making other people feel understood, and for discovering, again and again, that those two things together solve more conflicts than any argument ever could. I want to be honest with you about something from the start. I was not a naturally gifted communicator. I was, for a long time, the opposite. I was the person who got louder when challenged, who had a gift for identifying the weakest point in someone's argument and driving directly into it, who confused clarity with bluntness and bluntness with honesty. I came from a family where arguments were a form of connection, where raising your voice wasn't aggression, it was engagement, and where the person who stayed quiet was the one who didn't care enough to fight. I carried that wiring into my adult life, and I did real damage with it. Damage to relationships I valued. Damage to professional situations that deserved better. Damage to my own reputation in rooms where I thought I was performing competence but was actually performing fear. Because that's what most conflict behavior is, once you strip away the surface noise. Fear, not weakness. Fear. The fear of not being heard. The fear of being dismissed. The fear that if you back down even slightly, something essential about you will be lost. Understanding that fear, in yourself and in the people across from you, is the first move in everything that follows. The research on this is both surprising and, once you know it, completely obvious. Neuroscientists studying conflict and threat response have found that the human brain processes social rejection and disagreement through some of the same neural pathways it uses to process physical pain. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences demonstrated that the experience of social exclusion activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same region lit up by physical injury. What this means in practical terms is that when someone challenges your position aggressively, dismisses your perspective, or talks over you repeatedly, your brain is not experiencing a merely intellectual event. It is, at a neurological level, registering something closer to being hit. Your threat detection systems engage. Cortisol and adrenaline enter the bloodstream. Your capacity for nuanced thinking narrows. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for empathy, perspective-taking, and strategic thinking, begins to go offline. And then you say something you can't take back. This is not a character flaw. This is biology. But biology is not destiny. And that distinction is what this entire audiobook is built on. You cannot stop your brain from registering threat. You can learn to interrupt what happens next. The people you will meet throughout these chapters are not fictional composites or idealized examples. They are the difficult managers, the defensive partners, the dismissive colleagues, the angry parents, the stonewalling friends that most of us have encountered and most of us have handled badly at least once. They are also, in the moments we're least proud of, us. Because difficult people are not a separate species. They are people, like you, like me, whose nervous systems got overwhelmed, whose defenses went up, who stopped listening because they were too busy surviving. The skill of social intelligence is, at its core, the skill of reaching someone in that state, not by being louder, not by being smarter, by being the first one to stop fighting. There is a particular kind of strength required for that. It is not passive. It is not meek. It is not the resignation of someone who has given up on being heard. It is the deliberate, trained capacity to stay present when everything in you wants to escalate, to choose connection over conquest, at the exact moment when conquest feels most satisfying. That's what we're building here. Not niceness, strength. By the time you finish this, you will have a different relationship with conflict, not an absence of conflict. Conflict is a natural byproduct of two people having different needs, different histories, and different ways of seeing the world. You will still disagree with people. You will still encounter people who are unreasonable, dismissive, or genuinely difficult to deal with. But you will move through those encounters differently. You will have tools that work. You will understand what's actually happening beneath the surface of a difficult conversation. And you will have the lived experience, because we'll build it chapter by chapter, of having navigated something hard without losing yourself, or the relationship. The loudest room I've ever been in was inside my own head during a conflict I was determined to win. Learning to quiet that room was the hardest and most valuable thing I have ever done. Let's begin. The wiring beneath the words. Before we can talk about how to change the way you communicate, we need to talk about why you communicate the way you do. Not in a general, abstract sense, in the specific, neurological, deeply personal sense that explains why intelligent people say things. They don't mean why reasonable people become unreasonable under pressure, and why the same conversation can go beautifully one day and catastrophically the next, depending on nothing more than how much sleep someone got. The answer lives in what researchers call the threat response system, a network of structures in the brain centered around the amygdala that evolved over millions of years to keep us alive in a world full of physical dangers. The amygdala does not distinguish particularly well between a predator in the grass and a colleague who just rolled their eyes at your idea in a meeting. It processes threat, and when it detects threat, social, physical, professional, relational, it initiates a cascade of physiological responses that prepare your body for one of two primary options: fight or flee. Here's what that looks like in a conversation. Someone says something that lands as an attack, a dismissal, or a challenge. In approximately 200 milliseconds, faster than conscious thought, your amygdala has already begun processing the emotional content of that input. Stress hormones enter your bloodstream. Your heart rate increases. Blood flow is redirected toward your large muscle groups, away from the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for empathy, nuanced reasoning, and long-term thinking. You are now, neurologically speaking, operating with a fundamentally reduced capacity for the exact skills that productive conflict resolution requires. Psychologist Daniel Siegel, one of the leading researchers in interpersonal neurobiology, describes this as flipping your lid, a vivid metaphor for the moment when the rational, reflective upper brain loses its coordination with the reactive lower brain. When your lid is flipped, you are not thinking less clearly. You are operating on a fundamentally different processing system, the part of you that can hold someone else's perspective, that can consider long-term consequences, that can weigh the emotional impact of your next sentence. That part has been temporarily overridden by a system optimized for immediate survival. Understanding this is not an excuse for bad behavior in conflict. It is the beginning of accountability. Because once you understand what's actually happening in your body and your brain during a difficult conversation, you can stop being surprised by your own reactions and start building the capacity to intervene before those reactions do damage. The first thing to understand about your own conflict wiring is that it was shaped before you had any say in the matter. Your nervous system learned how to handle threat before you had language for it. The child who grew up in a house where conflict was loud and explosive developed a nervous system that maps raised voices as normal and silence after a fight as dangerous. The child who grew up in a house where conflict was handled through cold withdrawal and extended silence developed a nervous system that maps emotional distance as threat and often overperforms warmth to avoid it. Neither response is wrong. Both are adaptations, intelligent responses to the specific emotional environment you grew up in. And both, in your adult relationships and professional interactions, can produce outcomes that have nothing to do with what you actually want. I spent a long time thinking my conflict style was just who I was, that the way I got louder under pressure, the way I pushed back hard on any perceived criticism, the way I could never quite let something go even when I knew I should, was a fixed feature of my personality. It wasn't. It was a learned pattern, built on a neural foundation that had been laid down decades before I had any awareness of it. And learned patterns, as the neuroscience of neuroplasticity has consistently shown, can be changed. Not easily, not overnight, but fundamentally and permanently, with the right understanding and the right practice. The second piece of wiring to understand is what researchers call the negativity bias, the brain's evolved tendency to register negative information more intensely, more quickly, and more durably than positive information. The evolutionary logic is sound. The organism that overweights the dangerous is more likely to survive than the organism that underweights it. But in a modern conversation, this bias creates a consistent distortion. A single critical comment in an otherwise supportive conversation will typically register more powerfully than 3 genuine compliments. A dismissive tone in one sentence will often override the constructive content of the next 10. A raised voice in minute 3 of a 30-minute conversation will cast a neurological shadow over everything that follows. This is why tone matters so much more than people expect it to. Research by psychologist Albert Mehrabian, often misquoted, but directionally correct, suggests that in emotionally charged communication, the nonverbal dimensions of a message carry enormous weight. We are constantly reading tone, facial expression, posture, and pacing for threat signals. And our negativity bias means we are primed to find them. When you understand this, you stop wondering why someone took it the wrong way. You start asking what signals you were sending that gave their negativity bias something to work with. There's a third piece of the wiring, and it's perhaps the most consequential for the kind of conflict we're focusing on in this audiobook. The kind that happens between people who actually care about each other and actually want things to go well. Researchers call it the fundamental attribution error, and it describes a consistent cognitive bias in how we explain behavior. When we do something harmful or wrong, we tend to explain it through circumstance. I raised my voice because I was exhausted and under pressure. When someone else does something harmful or wrong, we tend to explain it through character. They raise their voice because they're aggressive and disrespectful. Same behavior, 2 completely different explanatory frames, one generous, one damning. This asymmetry poisons conflict at the interpretive level. Before a single word has been exchanged about the actual issue, both people in a conflict have often already constructed a narrative about what the other person's behavior means about who they are. And once you're operating from a character-based explanation of someone else's behavior, the conversation has left the realm of problem-solving and entered the realm of prosecution. You are no longer trying to resolve something, you are building a case. The antidote to the fundamental attribution error is not endless charity toward people who genuinely behave badly. It is a specific intellectual discipline, holding behavior and character as separate categories, and staying in the domain of behavior until you have real evidence that character is the issue. This is harder than it sounds. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, and once a pattern is registered, this person is dismissive, this person doesn't listen, this person always makes it about themselves. We begin filtering new information through it. Confirmation bias does the rest. What the most socially intelligent communicators share is not an absence of these biases. They have them. What they share is a practiced ability to notice when a bias is running, to name it internally, and to choose a different interpretation before committing to the one their nervous system handed them. That noticing, that moment of internal pause between stimulus and response, is the hinge on which everything else in this audiobook turns. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor whose thinking has shaped modern psychology in ways that are still being understood, wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space lies our freedom. He was writing about something far more dire than difficult conversations. But the principle applies with equal force to the moment just before you say the thing that makes everything worse. That space exists. Learning to find it, to widen it, to live in it long enough to choose, is the foundational skill of everything that follows. Your wiring is not your fate. It is your starting point. And knowing your starting point is the first step toward going somewhere different. When the brain declares war, there is a specific moment in every escalating conflict A moment most people miss because they're already inside it, when the conversation stops being about the topic and starts being about survival. The shift is rarely announced. It rarely feels like a shift. It feels to the person experiencing it like clarity, like finally seeing what this is really about, like being done pretending. That feeling of clarity is almost always a lie. What's actually happening in that moment is a neurological event that researchers have studied with increasing precision over the past 2 decades. It has a name in clinical contexts: amygdala hijack, a term coined by psychologist Daniel Goleman in his landmark work on emotional intelligence, and it describes the moment when the brain's threat detection system overrides the higher cortical functions responsible for rational, empathic, and strategic thought. When an amygdala hijack occurs, you do not think less. You think faster, louder, and with much greater certainty. The problem is that what you're thinking with is a system optimized not for accuracy or connection, but for winning or surviving. I want to spend some time in this chapter on what that actually looks like from the inside, because the most dangerous thing about an amygdala hijack is how normal it feels. When you're in it, you don't feel like you're having a neurological event. You feel like you're finally being honest. You feel like the gloves are coming off. You feel like you've been patient long enough, and now you're saying the thing you should have said 40 minutes ago. That feeling of righteous momentum, of finally, is one of the most reliable indicators that your prefrontal cortex has gone offline and your survival brain is now running the show. The physiological signature is measurable and consistent. Heart rate climbs above 100 beats per minute, a threshold that researcher John Gottman, who has studied couples in conflict for decades, identifies as the point at which productive conversation becomes neurologically unlikely. Blood pressure rises, breathing becomes shallower and faster, the muscles of the jaw and shoulders tighten, peripheral vision narrows. The body is preparing for a physical confrontation that isn't coming, using biological hardware that hasn't been updated since the Pleistocene. Gottman's research on couples, conducted over more than 30 years with data from thousands of relationships, identified what he calls flooding, the subjective experience of being overwhelmed by emotion during conflict, as one of the primary predictors of relationship failure over time. Not conflict itself, flooding. The difference is critical. Conflict, Gottman found, is not the enemy of healthy relationships. Almost every long-term relationship has recurring unresolved conflicts, topics that come up again and again, get discussed, get set aside, come up again. What distinguishes relationships that survive and thrive from those that deteriorate is not the absence of hard conversations, but the capacity of the people in them to stay physiologically regulated during those conversations, to keep the prefrontal cortex online, to remain, even under pressure, capable of hearing the person across from them. The cascade of an amygdala hijack follows a recognizable pattern once you know what to look for. It typically begins with a trigger, a word, a tone, an expression, a specific phrase that the nervous system has learned to register as threat. The trigger activates the amygdala, which sends an alarm signal before the conscious mind has processed the content of what was just said. The conscious mind then retroactively constructs a justification for the alarm. They're being disrespectful. They never listen. They're doing the thing again. The physical arousal intensifies, and then comes the behavioral response, usually one of 4: attack, defend, withdraw, or shut down. What makes this pattern so difficult to interrupt is that each step feels from the inside like a rational response to external provocation. It doesn't feel like you're running a threat response program. It feels like you're responding appropriately to someone who is, in fact, being unreasonable. And here is the uncomfortable truth. They may be being unreasonable. The person across from you may genuinely be saying something unfair, dismissive, or unkind. Your nervous system's threat assessment is not always wrong. The problem is not the assessment. The problem is what the assessment does to your capacity for response. Even when you are right about the threat, an amygdala hijack is one of the least effective ways to address it, because you are now operating in a mode optimized for combat, not for resolution. There's a concept in conflict psychology called the drama triangle, developed by psychiatrist Stephen Karpman in the 1960s, and still one of the most useful maps of how conflict roles get assigned and reinforced. In the drama triangle, every escalating conflict involves 3 positions: the persecutor, who attacks and blames, the victim, who feels wronged and powerless, and the rescuer, who attempts to fix things, often in ways that perpetuate the dynamic rather than resolve it. What makes the triangle so insidious is that people move between these roles within a single conversation, sometimes within a single exchange. The person who begins as a persecutor, "You always do this," becomes a victim when pushed back. "I can't believe you're attacking me for being honest." And then a rescuer when they sense the relationship is at risk. "I'm only saying this because I care about us." The roles shift, but the triangle keeps turning. Nobody wins. Everyone feels worse. Exiting the drama triangle requires something that feels counterintuitive in the middle of a conflict. It requires you to stop playing any of the roles, not to become the victim, not to rescue, not to attack, to step entirely outside the triangular dynamic and relate to the other person from a position that the triangle has no category for. That position is what we'll spend much of this audiobook building. It is not passivity. It is a specific, active, trained stance, one that requires understanding your own patterns well enough to catch yourself the moment you start sliding into a role you didn't choose. There's one more neurological reality worth understanding before we move on, and it concerns what happens after a hijack. Research on physiological recovery from acute stress responses shows that the body requires roughly 20 minutes to clear the stress hormones produced during a high arousal conflict episode. 20 minutes after the fight, even if the voices have lowered and the immediate trigger has been addressed, your nervous system is still carrying residual activation from the previous episode. This is why conversations that start calmly after a major fight often reignite unexpectedly, not because a new problem has emerged, but because the nervous system never fully returned to baseline. You are having a conversation in a body that still thinks the previous danger is present. This is the neurological basis for the advice, given by therapists, relationship counselors, and conflict mediators for decades, to take a break when things escalate, not because walking away from a hard conversation is a virtue, but because staying in it while flooded is almost always counterproductive. The break is not avoidance. It is physiology. It is giving your prefrontal cortex the time it needs to come back online, so that when you return to the conversation, you are actually capable of having it. Understanding when your brain has declared war, and understanding that declaration as a neurological event rather than a moral judgment, is the foundation of everything that follows. You cannot change what you cannot see, and once you can see the hijack as it happens, you have the one thing that changes everything: choice. The myth of winning. Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer too quickly. Think of the last argument you won. Not a debate, not a negotiation, an argument, a real conflict with someone who matters to you, where emotions were running and something felt at stake, and by the end, you had made your case so effectively that the other person had no reasonable response left. You had won. You were right, and they knew it. How did it feel the next morning? If you're honest, and the fact that you're listening to this suggests you're willing to be honest with yourself, the answer is probably somewhere between hollow and complicated, because the experience of winning an argument with someone you care about almost never delivers what it promised. The clarity you thought the win would bring, the relief, the resolution, somehow it isn't there. Instead, there's a kind of residue, a distance, a subtle tension in how they look at you or don't look at you, a conversation that got quieter in ways that have nothing to do with resolution. This is not accidental, it is structural. And understanding the structure of what winning actually costs is one of the most important cognitive shifts in this entire audiobook. The framework that illuminates this most clearly comes from the work of social psychologist Henri Tajfel and his development of social identity theory in the 1970s. Tajfel, working out of his own experience as a Jewish survivor of the Second World War who had witnessed what happened when group identity became a weapon, was fascinated by the psychological mechanisms that drove people to defend their group membership at almost any cost. What he found, in a series of now famous experiments, was that human beings derive a significant portion of their sense of self-worth from their identification with groups, and that this group identity is defended with the same intensity and through the same mechanisms as personal identity. Here is what this means in the context of an argument. When you challenge someone's position, especially on a topic they have publicly committed to, or that touches their identity as a competent, rational, or good person, you are not engaging their intellect alone. You are engaging their sense of self, and when the self is under threat, The organism does not evaluate the quality of the evidence being presented. It marshals resources for defense. This is why facts so frequently fail to resolve arguments. The intuitive assumption, shared by most people and embedded in most conflict resolution models that don't account for emotional intelligence, is that if you can simply present the right information clearly enough, the other person will update their position. They will see that you are correct. The argument will end. What actually happens, in most emotionally charged disagreements, is something closer to the opposite. The more clearly and forcefully you present evidence that contradicts someone's position, the more firmly they tend to hold it. Psychologists call this phenomenon the backfire effect, the counterintuitive finding that well-reasoned challenges to deeply held beliefs often strengthen rather than weaken them. The mechanism is identity protection. When someone's position is tied to their sense of who they are, their competence, their values, their history, conceding that position requires more than changing their mind. It requires reorganizing their self-concept, and the brain, which has a powerful investment in maintaining a coherent and stable sense of self, resists that reorganization with surprising force. The result is that your carefully constructed argument, delivered with precision and backed by evidence, lands not as useful information but as an attack. Their defenses go up, their cortisol rises, and they become, paradoxically, more committed to the position you were trying to dislodge. This is the fundamental structural problem with winning as a goal in conflict. Not that winning is wrong, but that winning, defined as making your case so effectively that the other person has no rational counter available, almost never produces the outcome it promises. It produces compliance without agreement, silence without resolution, and resentment dressed as closure. The person who concedes under argumentative pressure does not, in most cases, change their view. They change their strategy. They stop arguing because the cost has become too high, not because they have been genuinely persuaded. And the unexpressed disagreement, the concession made under pressure, the position they held that they were never truly heard on, all of that lives somewhere. It comes out later, sideways, in ways that are harder to trace and harder to resolve. I used to believe that the goal in any conflict was to be right. I am temperamentally inclined toward arguments. I find them clarifying, even energizing, in a way that I've come to understand not everyone does. And I had a talent for marshaling evidence and identifying the logical weaknesses in opposing positions. I thought this talent was an asset. It took a long time to understand the full cost of it. Not because being right is bad. Being right is fine. The problem was what I was unconsciously doing to the people I was being right at. I was making them lose. And people who are made to lose, even on questions where they were genuinely wrong, do not typically respond with gratitude and updated behavior. They respond with wounded pride and a quiet determination to find an arena where they can win instead. The alternative to winning as a goal is something that sounds, at first hearing, much less satisfying. Understanding as a goal, not agreement, not validation, not the abdication of your own perspective. Understanding, the specific, verifiable experience of having fully grasped what the other person is thinking and feeling, and having communicated that grasp clearly enough that they feel it. This sounds like a smaller thing than winning. It is, in practice, a much harder and much more powerful thing. Research by psychologist Daniel Weil captures this beautifully. Weil, who spent decades developing a collaborative model of couples therapy, found that the most reliably productive shift in a difficult conversation was not when one person successfully convinced the other, but when both people moved from adversarial positions to what he called collaborative problem-solving. The shared recognition that there is a problem and they are on the same side of it. That shift is not primarily intellectual. It is emotional. It requires one person to stop treating the conversation as a competition long enough for the other person's defenses to lower, their threat response to decrease, and their capacity for genuine engagement to return. That person, the one who makes the first move toward collaboration, who absorbs the initial defensive energy without returning it, who stays oriented toward understanding rather than victory, that person is not losing. That person is leading. And here is what I want you to hold from this chapter as we move forward. The most effective communicators in conflict are not the ones who make the best arguments. They are the ones who make the other person feel safe enough to stop defending and start talking. That safety, the experience of being genuinely heard rather than prosecuted, is the precondition for every meaningful shift that follows. You cannot reason someone out of a defensive crouch. You can only make it safe enough for them to uncrouch. The myth of winning is the belief that the goal of a hard conversation is to have the right position prevail. The truth is that the goal in any conflict worth the energy you're putting into it is to end up in a better place with the person than you were when it started. Sometimes that means changing their mind. Sometimes it means changing yours. Most often it means building the mutual understanding that makes the real issue visible for the first time, and finding that the real issue, once seen, is far more solvable than the one you were fighting about. What difficult people are really saying. There is a person in most people's lives who reliably makes conversations harder than they need to be. Maybe it's the colleague who turns every feedback session into a debate about who's really at fault. Maybe it's the family member who can't receive a simple request without hearing an accusation inside it. Maybe it's the partner who goes quiet for hours after a disagreement and then insists nothing is wrong. Maybe it's the manager who mistakes volume for authority and uses one consistently in place of the other. We call these people difficult. The word is convenient and not entirely wrong. Interacting with them does require more effort, more patience, more strategic thought than interacting with people whose nervous systems are better regulated or whose communication patterns are less defended. But the word difficult carries a hidden assumption that causes real problems. The assumption that the difficulty is intrinsic to the person, rather than a signal about something they cannot find another way to say. When I started paying attention to this, really paying attention, not just enduring difficult people, but studying what was happening beneath their behavior, I noticed something consistent. The person who attacks when questioned is almost always someone who has learned, through repeated experience, that being questioned leads to being diminished. The person who deflects responsibility in every conflict is almost always someone whose early experiences of accountability were entangled with shame rather than problem solving. The person who stonewalls is almost always someone whose nervous system learned that emotional engagement was dangerous, that staying in a hard conversation meant getting hurt. None of this makes their behavior acceptable. Behavior has consequences regardless of its origin, and understanding why someone acts the way they do is not the same as excusing it. But if you want to change the outcome of a conversation with a difficult person, you need to understand what their behavior is actually communicating, because what it appears to be communicating on the surface is almost never the whole story. Psychologist Marshall Rosenberg, whose work on nonviolent communication became one of the most practically useful frameworks in the history of conflict resolution, proposed a distinction that sounds simple and turns out to be profound. Every human behavior, however hostile or confusing on the surface, is an attempt to meet a need, not a want, a need. The fundamental needs that drive human behavior are relatively consistent across people and cultures. The need for safety, for respect, for autonomy, for connection, for competence, for fairness, for meaning. When those needs are being met, people are generally manageable. When those needs are threatened or unmet, people become their worst selves. And the more threatened the need, the more extreme the behavior. This is the translation key for difficult behavior. When someone becomes aggressive in a conversation, the underlying need is almost always safety or respect. They are defending against what their nervous system has registered as an attack on their standing, their competence, or their value. When someone withdraws and refuses to engage, the underlying need is almost always safety of a different kind. Protection from a conversation that their experience predicts will end in pain. When someone deflects, minimizes, or changes the subject, the underlying need is almost always autonomy, the protection of a self-concept that cannot currently absorb the information being offered. I want to give you a specific example of how this translation works in practice, because the abstract principle is only useful if you can apply it in real time under pressure, when your own nervous system would rather just respond to what's on the surface. Imagine you're having a conversation with a colleague, let's call him David, about a project that missed a deadline. You've prepared for this conversation, you have the facts, and your intention is genuinely constructive. You want to understand what happened so it doesn't happen again. You say, calmly and specifically, that the deliverable was 3 days late and that it affected the rest of the team's timeline. David immediately says with an edge in his voice that if the timeline had been more realistic in the first place, this wouldn't be a problem, that the project was under-resourced, that other people missed their pieces too, but nobody's having a conversation with them. On the surface, This is deflection. David is not taking responsibility. He is redistributing blame. He is making your reasonable observation into a grievance against him. Everything about his response invites you to either back down or escalate, to either accept the deflection or push harder on the accountability point, which will make him more defensive and more difficult to reach. But if you run his response through the translation key, something different becomes visible. David is not primarily trying to avoid accountability. David is telling you, in the only language available to him in this moment, that he feels singled out, that he feels the failure is being placed entirely on him when he experienced the situation as shared, that his competence and fairness are on the line in a way that feels threatening, that he needs to feel that the conversation is an honest accounting of a complex situation, not a prosecution of a predetermined verdict. When you can hear that, when you can translate the defensive behavior into the unmet need underneath it, your options change completely. Instead of pushing harder on the accountability point, which will simply intensify his threat response, you can address the need directly. You might say something like, "I hear that the timeline felt unrealistic and that you experienced the constraints as shared. I want to understand that fully, because if there are systemic issues that contributed to this, those matter. I'm not here to put this entirely on you. You haven't abandoned the accountability conversation. You've made it possible to actually have it. That's the move. Not abandoning your position. Not pretending the problem isn't there. Addressing the need before the position. Making it safe enough for the person across from you to lower their defenses enough to actually hear you. There are patterns to what difficult people are saying beneath their behavior, and learning to recognize these patterns shortens the translation time significantly. The person who gets loud is almost always saying, "I don't believe I'll be heard if I stay quiet." The person who personalizes everything is almost always saying, "My identity feels fragile in this conversation and I need to protect it." The person who brings up the past, who relitigates old arguments in the middle of a new one, is almost always saying, "I carry unresolved hurt from before, and it makes it impossible for me to trust that this conversation is new." The person who shuts down is almost always saying, "I have reached the limit of what I can process right now, and I don't have the words for it." None of these translations require you to agree with the behavior, to absorb it without response, or to abandon your own needs in the conversation. They require you to be, briefly, more interested in what's happening beneath the surface than in what's happening on it. That interest, that genuine curiosity about what this person is actually trying to communicate through their difficult behavior, is the single most disarming thing you can bring to a hard conversation. Because difficult people, in my experience, are not usually difficult because they want to be. They are difficult because they are in pain and they don't have a better way to express it. The moment someone across from you experiences the rare sensation of being genuinely understood, not agreed with, not managed, not handled, but actually understood, something shifts in them. The defenses lower. The volume drops. The need that was driving the difficult behavior begins, even partially, to be met, and a conversation that felt impossible 2 minutes ago becomes possible. That is not magic. It is neuroscience and it is practice, and it begins with a single question that you learn to hold in the back of your mind every time a conversation gets difficult. What does this behavior need me to understand? The pause that changes everything. If there is one physical practice in this audiobook, one thing that can be implemented immediately with no preparation, no special skill, and no perfect conditions, it is this: learn to pause. Not the pause of someone who has run out of things to say, not the passive silence of someone who has withdrawn from a conversation. A deliberate, conscious, physiologically purposeful pause, a micro gap inserted between stimulus and response, long enough for the prefrontal cortex to re-engage before the mouth moves. This sounds obvious. It is not easy. In the middle of a conflict, when your nervous system is activated and your body is primed for combat, the pressure to respond immediately is intense and feels entirely reasonable. The feeling is that if you pause, you will lose ground. That silence will be read as weakness or agreement, that the moment requires a response, and you are obligated to provide one now. These feelings are very convincing and almost completely wrong. The neurological case for the pause is compelling and specific. When the amygdala fires a threat response, the cascade of physiological arousal that follows takes time to build and time to subside. Research on this process shows that the initial spike of cortisol and adrenaline peaks within the first 30 to 90 seconds of a threat trigger, then begins to taper if no new threat stimulus is added. What this means in a conversation is that the 2 or 3 seconds between the moment you register a threat and the moment you speak are the most neurologically consequential seconds of the entire exchange. In those 2 or 3 seconds, you are either reinforcing the threat response by already preparing your counter, by tightening your posture, by building your case, or you are interrupting it. The pause is an interruption. It is a deliberate act of physiological regulation that tells your nervous system, I have registered the stimulus, I am not in danger, I am choosing my response. Done consistently, done even clumsily and imperfectly, it is one of the highest leverage interventions available to you in a difficult conversation. I want to be specific about what the pause is not, because the concept is frequently misunderstood in ways that make it useless. The pause is not suppression. Suppression, the deliberate pushing down of an emotional response, has been shown in research by psychologist James Gross and others to be physiologically expensive and interpersonally costly. People who chronically suppress their emotional responses show elevated cardiovascular arousal, reduced memory for the conversation, and decreased relationship satisfaction over time. Their interaction partners, interestingly, also show elevated cardiovascular arousal, suggesting that suppression is not invisible to the people around you. It registers as tension, as something withheld, as a conversation being managed rather than lived. The pause is not suppression. It is the opposite of suppression. Where suppression pushes the emotional response down and continues performing normalcy, the pause acknowledges the emotional response and uses it as information. You feel the spike of threat, the heat in your chest, the tightening of your jaw, the urgency of the counter-argument building in your throat, and instead of acting on it or suppressing it, you simply notice it. You say to yourself, internally and without drama, I am activated. I am having a threat response. I am going to take a moment before I speak. That internal narration, the simple act of labeling your own emotional state, has measurable neurological effects. Research by psychologist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA used functional MRI to show that when people label a negative emotional state in words, I feel angry, I feel threatened, I feel hurt, activity in the amygdala decreases and activity in the prefrontal cortex increases. The act of naming, in other words, literally shifts processing from the reactive brain to the reflective brain. It gives the prefrontal cortex a foothold. It creates the space that everything else requires. In practice, the pause looks like a breath, not a dramatic, visible, I am visibly calming myself breath that will read as theatrical and may actually escalate the other person's defenses. A quiet breath, internal, almost invisible, that you take while your face remains present and engaged. In that breath, you are doing several things simultaneously. You are interrupting the automatic response cascade. You are labeling your own state internally. You are creating the microsecond of distance between stimulus and response, in which choice becomes possible. What you do with that choice varies depending on the conversation. Sometimes the right response is a question, a genuine open-ended question that buys more time and shifts the dynamic from adversarial to exploratory. Sometimes the right response is an acknowledgement, a brief, specific reflection of what you just heard that signals you were actually listening before you start talking. Sometimes the right response is simply a slightly longer pause, a moment of silence that, counterintuitively, communicates more presence and attentiveness than most immediate verbal responses. The discomfort of silence in conflict is real, and it is worth examining. Most people in a difficult conversation fill silence instinctively, immediately, and without thought, because silence feels dangerous. It feels like the conversation has gone wrong, like something is being withheld, like the other person is losing interest or building a case against you. This discomfort is almost universal, and it produces one of the most consistently counterproductive patterns in conflict: speaking before thinking and then spending the rest of the conversation managing the consequences of something said under pressure that didn't represent what you actually meant. But silence, used deliberately, communicates something that words rarely can, that you are taking the other person seriously enough to think before you respond. In a culture of instant reaction, of immediate counter-arguments and rapid-fire responses, the person who pauses before speaking signals something rare and valuable, that your words landed, that they are being processed, that you are not simply waiting for your turn to talk. That signal, That experience of being genuinely received is one of the most disarming things you can offer in a difficult conversation. There's a related practice worth building alongside the pause, the practice of noticing your body's early warning system. The physiological signs of threat activation are usually available before the emotional experience becomes overwhelming, before the lid, in Siegel's terms, has fully flipped. The tightening in the jaw, the slightly faster breathing, the heat rising in the chest or the neck, the subtle urge to lean forward or to pull back. These are signals. They are your nervous system's early warning that a threat response is building. Learning to read them, to catch the activation at stage 1 rather than stage 5, gives you dramatically more options than waiting until you're already flooded. One concrete practice I have found more useful than almost any other. Before a conversation you know will be difficult, take 60 seconds to notice your current state. Not to change it, just to inventory it. Am I already activated going into this? Is there residual stress from somewhere else that I'm carrying in? Am I hungry, tired, or physically depleted in a way that will reduce my capacity for regulation? This brief inventory does something that seems small and turns out to be significant. It separates your pre-existing state from the conversation you're about to have. It means you're less likely to attribute your own physiological state to the other person's behavior, and more likely to respond to what's actually happening, rather than to what you're primed to expect. The pause is a practice. Like any practice, it is built through repetition in low-stakes situations before it becomes available in high-stakes ones. Notice the moments in small disagreements, the mild annoyance, the minor frustration, when you can insert the pause and feel what it gives you. Build the muscle in those moments. When the large, real, high-pressure conflict arrives, and it will, the pause will be there, not as a technique you're trying to remember, but as a reflex you've built into your nervous system through deliberate, patient practice. Everything that follows in this audiobook depends on this one thing: the ability to create space between what happens and what you do next. The pause is how you create it. How to listen like a weapon. The word weapon in this chapter's title is intentional, and I want to acknowledge immediately that it will make some people uncomfortable. Good listening, empathic, attentive, generous listening, is not typically framed in strategic terms. It is framed as a virtue, a gift, a form of care, and it is those things. But it is also, in the context of difficult conversations, one of the most strategically powerful tools available to you. Calling it a weapon is not cynical. It is an attempt to give it the status it deserves in a conversation about conflict, where most people are focused on what to say, and almost no one is focused enough on what to hear. Let me be clear about what kind of listening I'm talking about, because the word listening covers an enormous range of behaviors, most of which are not what I mean. Most people in most conversations are not listening. They are waiting. They are constructing their response, monitoring their own internal experience, evaluating the quality of the argument being made against theirs, and maintaining a level of surface attention sufficient to catch the moment when it becomes their turn to speak. This is not listening. It is a performance of listening, and most people, even without being able to name exactly what's missing, can feel the difference. Real listening, the kind that changes the trajectory of a difficult conversation, is an act of radical attention. It requires temporarily suspending your own perspective, not because your perspective doesn't matter, but because the other person's perspective cannot be received while yours is actively running in the foreground. It requires attending not just to the content of what is being said, but to the emotional texture beneath it, the tone, the pace, the words chosen and the ones avoided, the body language that either matches or contradicts the verbal message. And it requires something that goes against most people's instincts in conflict. It requires you to be more interested in understanding than in being understood, at least for the period of time that you are in listening mode. The research on the effects of genuine listening is remarkable. Studies in clinical psychology have consistently found that patients in therapy report feeling better, more understood, more hopeful, more capable of change, after sessions where the therapist primarily listened and reflected, compared to sessions where the therapist offered more active interpretation and advice. This finding, replicated across multiple contexts and cultures, suggests something important. Being truly heard is, in itself, therapeutic. It reduces threat activation. It lowers cortisol. It creates the neurological conditions under which genuine reconsideration becomes possible. In a conflict context, this means that the person across from you, who is currently being difficult, defensive, or unreasonable, that person can shift, often, quite quickly, not because you have found the right argument, but because you have made them feel genuinely heard. And the moment they feel heard, their threat response decreases. Their prefrontal cortex re-engages. They become, measurably and observably, more capable of listening to you. This is what I mean by listening like a weapon. Not that you are listening manipulatively, as a tactic to soften someone up. You are listening genuinely, fully, with real interest in what they are experiencing. And the effect of that genuine listening is that the conversation becomes possible in a way it wasn't before. The weapon is not deployed against the person. It is deployed against the impasse. There are specific skills that distinguish real listening from its performance, and they can be learned and practiced. The first is what psychologist Carl Rogers called active reflection, the practice of reflecting back, in your own words, the essential content and emotional texture of what you just heard before responding with your own perspective. This sounds like, so what I'm hearing is that you felt blindsided by the announcement, and that the timing made you feel like you weren't consulted, even though you should have been. Is that right? It does not sound like, I understand, which is a claim, not a demonstration, or like an immediate pivot to your own response. Active reflection does several things simultaneously. It demonstrates that you were actually listening, which creates immediate trust. It gives the other person the experience of being understood, which lowers their defensive arousal. It gives you the opportunity to confirm that you understood correctly, which protects against the misinterpretations that so frequently derail difficult conversations, and it slows the conversation down to a pace at which real understanding becomes possible. The second skill is what conflict researchers call tracking, the practice of following the emotional thread of a conversation rather than just its logical content. In any difficult conversation, there are two conversations happening simultaneously. The surface conversation, which is about the topic, the event, the decision, the behavior, and the underneath conversation, which is about what the topic, event, decision, or behavior means to the people involved. The surface conversation is where most people spend all of their attention. The underneath conversation is where the conflict actually lives. Tracking means keeping one part of your attention on the underneath conversation at all times. It means noticing when the emotional temperature shifts, when a word lands differently than the others, when the pace changes, when the body tightens, and treating those shifts as important information. It means being willing, occasionally, to name what you're noticing. When I said that, something shifted for you. What was that? This question, simple, direct, genuinely curious, can do more to move a stuck conversation than 10 minutes of logical argumentation, because it addresses the underneath conversation directly and gives the other person permission to be honest about what's actually driving them. The third skill is what I think of as listening for the ask. In most difficult conversations, especially those that have escalated to the point of heat and confusion, people are not clearly articulating what they actually need. They are expressing pain, frustration, resentment, the emotional residue of an unmet need, in ways that make the underlying need hard to identify. Your job as a listener in those moments is to hear through the expression to the need, to ask yourself, beneath what they are saying, what are they asking for? Not necessarily asking me to do something. What do they need from this conversation to feel like it was worth having? Sometimes what they need is acknowledgement, the specific experience of having their perspective validated as understandable, even if not agreed with. Sometimes what they need is information, facts that their version of the story is missing and that, once received, would shift their interpretation. Sometimes what they need is repair, a gesture of accountability, an acknowledgement of impact, a signal that the relationship is more important than the argument. And sometimes what they need is simply to finish, to say the thing completely, without interruption or rebuttal, and to have it received. When you learn to listen for the ask, you discover something that reliably surprises people. Most of what difficult people are asking for is far more available than what they are demanding. The demand is often enormous and unreasonable. Total vindication, complete capitulation, perfect understanding. The underlying ask is usually much simpler. See me, hear me, acknowledge that my experience is real. I have watched that recognition, offered simply and specifically, without performance, end conflicts that had been running for years. Real listening is not a passive skill. It is an active, demanding, sophisticated practice. It requires you to manage your own reactivity while fully engaging with someone else's experience. It requires you to hold your perspective without needing to express it until the moment is right. It requires a quality of attention that most of us give to very few people and almost no one in conflict. When you give it, it changes the conversation, almost every time. Naming without blaming. There is a sentence structure that has done more damage to more relationships, personal and professional, than almost any other. It goes like this: you make me feel. You make me feel dismissed. You make me feel disrespected. You make me feel like nothing I do is ever enough. The sentence feels honest. It feels vulnerable. It feels like exactly the kind of direct emotional communication that healthy relationships are supposed to include. It is, in fact, one of the most reliably escalating constructions available in the English language. The reason is grammatical and psychological simultaneously. You make me feel places the origin of the emotional experience entirely outside the speaker and entirely inside the other person. It makes the listener, automatically, structurally, before the sentence is even finished, responsible for the speaker's internal state. And people who are told they are responsible for someone else's pain respond in one of two ways. They either capitulate defensively, taking on guilt that may not be accurate and building resentment in the process, or they push back hard against the attribution, disputing the emotional claim because accepting it feels like accepting a verdict they didn't agree to. Neither response leads anywhere productive. Marshall Rosenberg's framework for nonviolent communication offers a specific alternative that is both more honest and more effective. Instead of, "You make me feel dismissed," the construction becomes, "When you interrupted me 3 times in the meeting, I felt dismissed." On the surface, these two sentences seem similar. They are not. The first makes an attribution, a claim about the other person's power over you. The second makes an observation followed by a feeling, a specific behavioral event connected to a specific emotional response. The difference in how each lands in a conversation is not subtle. The observation plus feeling construction does something neurologically important for the person receiving it. It separates the behavior, which can be discussed, examined, and if necessary changed, from the person whose character and intent are not on trial. It gives the listener a clear, specific event to respond to, rather than a diffuse accusation about who they are. And it opens a conversation rather than closing it, because after, "When you did X, I felt Y," the natural next question is, "Tell me more about what happened for you." Whereas after, "You make me feel Y," the natural next response is a defense against the charge. This is what I mean by naming without blaming. The skill of describing your emotional experience specifically and honestly, in a way that invites engagement rather than defense. It requires 3 things: precision about the behavior you are responding to, honesty about the feeling you experienced, and the discipline to separate those 2 things from any interpretation of what the behavior means about the other person's character or intentions. That third part is the hardest. In the heat of a difficult conversation, the space between behavior and interpretation collapses. The person who interrupted you didn't just interrupt you. They interrupted you because they don't respect you, because they never have, because this is a pattern that goes back years. By the time the words come out, they are carrying not just the specific incident, but the entire interpretive weight you've placed on it, and the person across from you receives not a clear communication about what happened and how it landed, but a dense multi-layered signal that the specific event was just the latest evidence in a case being built against them. Rosenberg called these interpretive layers life-alienating communication, language that, however emotionally authentic it feels to the speaker, creates distance rather than connection, because it substitutes evaluation for observation. The discipline of nonviolent communication, at its core, is the discipline of staying with observation long enough to make the feeling reachable, rather than rushing to evaluation in a way that puts the other person immediately on trial. I want to address a common misunderstanding about this approach, because I encounter it regularly. The concern that naming without blaming means softening your communication, minimizing your experience, or being inauthentic about the intensity of what you feel. It does not. There is nothing soft about, "When you told me in front of the entire team that my numbers were wrong, I felt humiliated and I'm still feeling it." That is a precise, honest, direct communication. It is also far more likely to be received than, You humiliated me in front of the team. Because the first makes the listener curious about your experience and accountable for a specific behavior, while the second makes them defensive about a character accusation. The power of precise emotional language in conflict is consistently underestimated. Research by psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett on the concept she calls emotional granularity, the ability to identify and articulate fine distinctions in emotional experience, shows that people who have larger emotional vocabularies and can make more specific distinctions between their emotional states have measurably better outcomes in conflict, stress management, and interpersonal relationships. The person who can distinguish between feeling disrespected, feeling dismissed, feeling invisible, and feeling misunderstood has far more information available to them and to the person they're talking to than the person who registers all of those as simply upset. This is a skill that can be developed. It requires building your emotional vocabulary, expanding the range of words available to you for internal states, so that when something happens in a difficult conversation, you can identify with precision what you're actually experiencing, rather than reaching for the nearest general category. It requires slowing down your internal process in the moment between sensation and expression, long enough to ask, what, specifically, is this? Not just bad, not just hurt. What exactly is this? That specificity changes what's available in a conversation. When you can say, I felt blindsided rather than I felt bad, the person across from you has something concrete to respond to. When you can say, I felt excluded from a decision that directly affects my work, rather than I felt disrespected, the conversation has a specific entry point. Specificity is generous. It gives the other person something real to work with rather than leaving them to navigate a fog of undifferentiated negative feeling. There is one more dimension to naming without blaming that deserves attention: the naming of your own contribution. The most effective communicators in conflict have a capacity that is genuinely rare, the capacity to acknowledge their own part in a dynamic without using that acknowledgement as a bargaining chip. Most people, when they acknowledge their contribution to a conflict, do it in a way that is structurally conditional. I know I could have handled that better, but the but cancels the acknowledgement. It signals that the acknowledgement was not genuine. It was strategic preparation for the real message, which is the thing after the but. The person on the receiving end registers this and discounts the acknowledgement accordingly. A genuine acknowledgement of your own contribution, offered not as a tactic but as an honest accounting, lands differently. It creates a quality of safety in the conversation that almost nothing else can produce, because it signals that you are not primarily interested in being exonerated. You are interested in understanding what happened, and in that signal is the invitation to a different kind of conversation entirely, one where both people are trying to figure out the truth together, rather than construct competing versions of it. Name what happened. Name what you felt. Leave the other person's character out of it. And when you contributed to the problem, name that too, without conditions. That is the foundation of every conversation that actually goes somewhere. The architecture of apology. Most apologies don't work, not because the person giving them doesn't mean them, but because they are structurally incomplete in ways that prevent them from doing what an apology is supposed to do. And what an apology is supposed to do, its actual function, beneath the social ritual, is restore a sense of safety and fairness to a relationship that has been disrupted by harm. When an apology fails to do that, it is almost always because one or more of its essential structural components is missing. The research on apology is more rigorous than most people expect. Psychologist Roy Lewicki at Ohio State University conducted studies examining what recipients of apologies actually need in order to find them satisfying. In order to feel that an apology has genuinely addressed the harm, rather than merely performed remorse. His findings identified 6 components that effective apologies contain, and found that not all components carry equal weight. The most critical, by a significant margin, was acknowledgement of responsibility, the specific, unhedged recognition that the harm occurred and that you were its cause. The second most critical was an offer of repair, a concrete signal that you intend to address the consequences of what happened, not just express regret about them. What most people offer instead of these is expression of regret. I'm sorry you feel that way, or I'm sorry things got so difficult, which is technically an apology and functionally a non-apology. The construction, I'm sorry you feel that way, has become almost universally recognized as a deflection because it acknowledges the other person's emotional state without acknowledging the behavior that produced it. It performs remorse while avoiding accountability, and the person receiving it, who came hoping to feel heard and valued, leaves feeling managed. The architecture of a real apology has a specific sequence, and the sequence matters. It begins with acknowledgement of the specific behavior, not a general admission of wrongdoing, but a named, precise description of what you did. I interrupted you every time you tried to speak in that meeting is an acknowledgement. I wasn't always the best listener is not. The specificity of the acknowledgement signals that you actually understand what happened, rather than offering a vague gesture toward the general vicinity of your mistake. The second component is acknowledgement of impact, a genuine engagement with the effect your behavior had on the other person, separate from your intentions. This is the component most frequently skipped, and its absence is one of the primary reasons apologies fail. When you skip the impact and move immediately to explanation or repair, you signal, however unintentionally, that you are more interested in resolving your own discomfort than in fully receiving the consequences of what you did. The other person needs to know that you understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end, not that you felt bad about it, that you understand what it was like for them. I interrupted you every time you tried to speak, and I imagine that felt dismissive and frustrating, like your perspective wasn't valued in a room where it should have been. That sentence does something that "I'm sorry I interrupted you" cannot. It demonstrates that you have taken the other person's experience seriously enough to imagine it, specifically and honestly, from their position. The third component is the explanation, and here precision of placement matters enormously. An explanation placed before acknowledgement of responsibility and impact will be received as excuse-making, regardless of its accuracy. The same explanation, offered after genuine acknowledgement, can be received as context, information that helps the other person understand how this happened without canceling the acknowledgement that it did. I was managing 3 simultaneous crises that morning, and I was operating from a place of high anxiety that made me less available to others than I should have been. That doesn't excuse what happened, but it's the honest context, said after a genuine acknowledgement. This lands very differently than said before one. The fourth component is the offer of repair, the specific actionable signal that you intend to do something different. This is where most apologies, even ones that have been structurally sound up to this point, become vague and unconvincing. I'll try to do better is not repair. It is a good intention, which is not the same thing. Repair is concrete. In our next meeting, I'm going to make a point of finishing my thought only after yours is complete, and if I catch myself interrupting, I'm going to stop and ask you to continue. That level of specificity communicates genuine seriousness of intent. It gives the other person something observable to measure your follow-through against. It transforms the apology from a closing statement into the opening of a behavioral commitment. There is a fifth component that Lewicki's research identifies as significant but situational: the request for forgiveness. I want to be careful here, because this is the component most often weaponized. Used to transfer the burden of the apology from the person who caused harm to the person who received it. "I'm so sorry. I just hope you can forgive me," places the receiver in a position of obligation that they did not choose and may not be ready for. Forgiveness, when it comes, should come freely, on the receiver's timeline, in response to genuine repair, not as a social tax on the apology. The most important thing I can tell you about apology is this: the discomfort of giving a real one is the point. A genuine acknowledgement of responsibility, followed by a genuine engagement with impact, followed by a genuine commitment to repair. That sequence requires you to stay present in your own accountability in a way that is uncomfortable in direct proportion to how seriously you take it. If an apology feels completely comfortable, it is probably not quite reaching the level of honesty required. The discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is real. And real apologies, the ones that meet all 4 components given without conditions or bargaining, do something extraordinary. They restore, not always immediately, not always completely, but they begin a process of restoration that no amount of argumentation, explanation, or time alone can replicate. They signal that the relationship is more important than the ego investment in being blameless. And in that signal is something the other person rarely receives and almost always needs: proof that you can be trusted with the truth about your own behavior. Boundaries that don't break relationships. The word boundary has become so overused in popular psychology that it has lost much of its original precision. It appears everywhere, in self-help books, in therapy offices, in casual conversations about difficult family members, and it is used to mean everything from, "I don't want to do that," to, "I have ended this relationship." The inflation of the word has made the concept harder to apply well, because it has collapsed two very different things into one: the preference and the limit. A preference is something you would like to have respected, but can negotiate around. A limit is a non-negotiable, a line whose crossing changes the nature of the relationship. Treating preferences as limits makes you rigid and exhausting to be around. Treating limits as preferences makes you a person without functional boundaries, someone whose stated lines are understood by the people around them to be soft, revisable, and ultimately unenforceable. The confusion between these two categories is at the root of most boundary failures in relationships. People announce boundaries they don't intend to enforce, which teaches the people around them that announcements are not real. They enforce limits they've never announced, which surprises and confuses the people around them who were operating in good faith. They escalate to ultimatums when earlier, quieter conversations would have been both sufficient and more dignified. And they confuse the act of setting a boundary, saying the sentence, with the reality of a boundary, which is not a sentence at all. A boundary is a pattern of behavior over time. It is what you consistently do, not what you once said. The research on boundary function in relationships identifies a quality that effective limit setters share across contexts. They are clear, specific, and calm. Not cold, calm. There is a critical distinction between the two. Cold communicates distance and punishment. I am withdrawing from you because of what you did. Calm communicates clarity and self-respect. I am telling you what is and is not workable for me, and I am doing it from a place of stability rather than reactivity. The calmness is what makes a boundary credible. When a limit is announced in a moment of high emotional activation, shouted, wept, declared in the middle of an escalated fight, it carries the signature of reactivity rather than intention. The person receiving it has reason to wonder whether it is a genuine limit or the hyperbolic expression of a flooded nervous system. When the same limit is communicated from a place of calm, after the acute emotion has been processed, in a direct and specific sentence without theatrical delivery, it lands as a real thing. It lands as information about who you are and what you require, rather than as a weapon deployed in a conflict. There is a framework I find consistently useful for communicating limits in a way that preserves the relationship while protecting the boundary. It has three components, and they appear in this order: the observation, the impact, and the request. The observation names the specific behavior, not the pattern, not the history, not the character interpretation, but the specific, recent, nameable event. The impact describes what that behavior costs, in practical terms, in emotional terms, or both. The request states clearly and specifically what you need to be different without ultimatum, unless you are genuinely prepared to enforce one. It sounds like this: when you call me after 10 p.m. about work issues, I lose the ability to sleep well, and I'm depleted the next day. I need work conversations to end by 8 p.m. That is a complete structurally sound communication of a limit. It does not include or else. It does not include you always or you never. It does not include a character assessment of the person's insensitivity or disrespect. It is a behavior, a consequence, and a request. If the behavior continues after the request, the boundary conversation becomes a different kind of conversation, one about whether this relationship can work under these conditions. But that conversation is not necessary unless and until the request has been clearly made, and clearly not honored. One of the most important insights I encountered in the research on interpersonal limits came from the work of psychologist Henry Cloud, who has written extensively on the psychology of boundaries in personal and professional life. Cloud distinguishes between two fundamentally different reasons people fail to set or maintain limits. They either don't know they're allowed to, or they do know, but fear the consequence. Both failures are real and they require different interventions. The person who doesn't know, they're allowed to set limits. Often someone who grew up in an environment where their needs were consistently subordinated to someone else's, or where expressing a limit was met with anger, guilt, or abandonment, needs a different conversation than the person who knows their limits, but is afraid that expressing them will cost them the relationship. The first needs permission, which is often the work of therapy and self-understanding. The second needs a reframe, the recognition that a limit, communicated clearly and from a place of respect, does not threaten a healthy relationship. It protects one. The relationships in your life that cannot survive your being honest about your limits are relationships that were already costing you more than they should. This is the essential paradox of limits in relationships. The act that feels most likely to damage a relationship, saying no, drawing a line, insisting on something, is often the act that most protects it, because relationships built on the unexpressed needs and swallowed limits of one or both people are not actually close. They are arrangements. And arrangements, however comfortable they appear on the surface, erode the authentic connection that makes relationships worth having. Setting a limit from a place of genuine self-respect, communicated with calm and care, is one of the most loving things you can do, both for the person receiving it, who now has accurate information about how to be in relationship with you, and for the relationship itself, which can now be built on reality rather than performance. When someone won't meet you halfway, there is a version of this audiobook that would tell you the techniques in the previous chapters work on everyone, every time, under every condition. That version would be dishonest. The truth is that some people, in some states, in some seasons of their lives, are not available for the kind of conversation this book describes, and learning to recognize that unavailability and to respond to it wisely rather than reactively is as important as any of the other skills we've built. There is a meaningful difference between someone who is defensive, which is almost everyone in a threatening conversation, and someone who is fundamentally unwilling to engage at the level of honesty required for resolution. Defensiveness is a state, temporary, physiologically driven, responsive to the right conditions. Unwillingness is a choice or a pattern so entrenched it functions like one. Treating them identically produces chronic frustration, pouring empathy and skill into a dynamic where the other person is not available to receive it, and then concluding, wrongly, that you are the problem. The signs of genuine unavailability are different from the signs of high defensiveness, and they are learnable. The person who is highly defensive will typically escalate in direct proportion to being challenged, then de-escalate when the challenge is removed or when safety is genuinely restored. They are reactive, not strategic. Their difficulty is driven by a nervous system in threat mode, and the tools in this book, the pause, the listening, the naming, the acknowledgement, will generally reach them, given time and consistency. The person who is genuinely unavailable for honest engagement operates differently. Their behavior is more consistent across contexts. Defensive, regardless of how safe the conversation is made. They tend to use agreed-upon emotional language strategically rather than honestly, expressing vulnerability as a tactic rather than a genuine disclosure, using your empathy against you rather than receiving it. They consistently redirect accountability, not because they're flooded but because accountability has become genuinely intolerable, a threat to a self-concept that cannot absorb any modification, and they tend to be better, not worse, after successful manipulation of a previous conversation, rewarded by the pattern rather than troubled by it. I want to be careful here, because diagnosing someone as permanently unavailable for genuine connection is a serious assessment and an easy one to make erroneously, when what you're actually dealing with is a person who is available, but whose availability has a different shape than yours. The person who needs more time before they can re-engage after a conflict is not unavailable. The person who finds certain emotional registers overwhelming and withdraws from them is not unavailable. The person who has a different cultural script for conflict than you do, one that reads as stonewalling or deflection, to you but functions as regulation within their own framework, is not unavailable. Unavailability is about consistent, deliberate, strategic resistance to honest engagement, not about having a different style of processing. When you are genuinely dealing with someone who will not meet you halfway, not because they can't right now, but because the pattern is stable and long-standing and unresponsive to the interventions that reach other people, the most useful reframe is this. Your goal is not to fix the dynamic. Your goal is to protect yourself within it, while deciding what relationship with this person is actually sustainable. That protection takes several forms. The first is expectations management, adjusting what you expect from this specific person in this specific relationship to what the evidence actually supports, rather than what you wish were true or what would be true if they were a different person. Chronic disappointment in a relationship is often the product of measuring someone against an idealized version of themselves that the evidence has never supported. When you adjust your expectations to match the person who actually shows up, not giving up on the relationship, but being honest about its actual contours, you stop spending emotional energy on the gap between who they are and who you need them to be. The second form of protection is strategic disengagement, the deliberate withdrawal of your emotional investment from the outcome of particular conversations, particularly the ones that have a fixed result regardless of how they begin. If you have had the same conversation with the same person 30 times and it has ended the same way every time, the 31st conversation is not going to go differently because you've read a book about empathic communication. The conversation itself is not the leverage point. The leverage point is the relationship's overall structure, what you are willing to be available for, under what conditions, and what you will do when those conditions are not met. The third and hardest is the acceptance of irreducible loss. Some conflicts do not resolve. Some relationships remain stuck at a level of difficulty that does not respond to skill or patience or time. Some people, for reasons that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with damage they carry from long before you met, are not currently capable of the reciprocity that a genuine relationship requires. Accepting that, without bitterness, without self-blame, without the exhausting project of trying to become different enough or skilled enough to finally reach someone who is not available to be reached, is not giving up. It is a form of profound realism that protects your capacity to invest meaningfully in the relationships where real reciprocity is possible. The skill of discernment, of knowing when to stay in the hard conversation and when to change the structure of the relationship, may be the most mature skill in this entire audiobook. It cannot be reduced to a formula. It requires honest self-examination. Am I withdrawing because I've genuinely assessed that engagement isn't productive, or because I'm avoiding the discomfort of staying present? It requires evidence. Has this person shown in the past any capacity for the kind of engagement I'm hoping for? And it requires clarity about your own limits. What can you sustain? At what cost to yourself? And for how long? There is no failure in recognizing that someone cannot meet you where you are. There is only the choice of what to do with that recognition. The conversations you keep avoiding. There is a category of conversation that almost everyone has at least one of. The conversation that needs to happen, that has needed to happen for months or possibly years, that you have rehearsed in your head 100 times and never quite been able to start. The conversation with the friend about the thing they did that you never addressed. The conversation with the family member about the pattern that keeps repeating. The conversation with yourself about the role you've been playing in a dynamic you claim not to want. These avoided conversations have a consistent set of characteristics. They feel larger the longer they are postponed. The topic that might have been a 10-minute conversation 6 months ago has become, through accumulation of resentment and rehearsal, a massive psychological object that seems to require perfect conditions and perfect words before it can be approached. They leak into other interactions. The unspoken thing becomes a kind of emotional static that distorts other conversations, making small things feel large and easy, things feel difficult, and they exact a chronic cost. The ongoing expenditure of energy required to maintain the avoidance, to root around the topic, to manage the relationship while keeping the real thing unaddressed. The psychology of avoidance in interpersonal conflict has been studied extensively, and the findings are consistent and counterintuitive. Avoidance does not reduce the distress associated with a difficult conversation. It amplifies it. Each time the avoided conversation is rehearsed internally and then not initiated, the nervous system registers a small but real threat activation, the anticipation of danger, and then the relief of not having to face it, which actually reinforces the avoidance behavior. The topic becomes more charged with each postponement, not less, and the relationship pays a compounding cost. Connection that could have been deepened through honest engagement is instead maintained at a surface level, frozen at the moment before the unspoken thing. What keeps people from starting the conversations they need to have is almost never a lack of words. It is almost always one of three things: fear of the other person's reaction, fear of the relationship's fragility, or uncertainty about their own right to raise the issue. These fears are not irrational. The other person's reaction may indeed be difficult. The relationship may indeed be more fragile than it appears, and the question of when and how to raise a grievance is genuinely complex. But these legitimate concerns have been allowed in most avoided conversations to become absolute prohibitions rather than difficulties to be navigated. The first thing required to start an avoided conversation is a reframe of what the conversation is for. Most people approach avoided conversations as confrontations, events in which something will be accused, something will be defended, and something will be lost. That frame makes the conversation feel dangerous before it begins. The alternative frame, and it is not a soft one, it is a more accurate one, is that the conversation is an attempt to bring the relationship into alignment with reality, to address the gap between what the relationship claims to be and what it is currently experiencing, to give the other person information they need in order to understand what's actually happening for you. That frame makes the conversation an act of respect rather than an act of aggression. The second thing required is a specific opening that reduces the other person's defensiveness in the first 10 seconds, because the first 10 seconds of a difficult conversation set the neurological tone for everything that follows. An opening that begins with accusation or grievance immediately activates the other person's threat response before you've had a chance to establish safety. An opening that signals care and intention, that makes it clear you are raising this because the relationship matters, not because you want to prosecute, gives the conversation a chance to be received rather than defended against. It can sound something like, "There's something I've been carrying around that I haven't known how to bring up, and I think it's affecting how we are with each other. I'd really like to talk about it, and I want us to be okay on the other side of the conversation." That opening does several things. It acknowledges that you've been managing something, which is honest, and often recognized by the other person who has sensed it. It signals care for the relationship. It gives the other person a moment to prepare rather than being ambushed. And it creates a shared frame. This is a conversation both of us are going to navigate together, rather than casting them as the defendant and you as the plaintiff. The conversation you keep avoiding is almost certainly more survivable than it feels from the outside. Most of the catastrophic outcomes your mind has generated during its 100 rehearsals, the relationship ending, the reaction being unmanageable, the thing being unforgivable, exist primarily in anticipatory anxiety rather than in realistic probability. The vast majority of avoided conversations, when finally had, produce something far more workable than the scenario the avoidance was protecting against. Sometimes they produce relief so immediate and complete that the avoidance itself becomes incomprehensible in retrospect. Start the conversation you have been avoiding, not perfectly, not when conditions are ideal. Soon, with the opening that signals care rather than accusation, and with the willingness to stay in it even when it gets uncomfortable. The relationship on the other side of that conversation will be closer to the one you actually want than anything you can build while keeping the real thing unspoken. Disagreeing without destroying the most socially intelligent people I have encountered, the ones whose relationships survive conflict, whose professional environments are genuinely functional, whose long-term partnerships have real depth, share a quality that initially looks like agreement. They seem to get along with almost everyone. Disagreements with them feel different than disagreements with other people. More interesting, less threatening, easier to leave without a wound. You might spend an hour arguing passionately with one of them and walk away feeling energized and respected, rather than defensive and diminished. The quality they share is not agreement. Many of them disagree frequently and with conviction. The quality is the ability to disagree without threatening the other person's fundamental experience of being valued, to hold a different position without making the position holding feel like a verdict on the person. 2. Challenge an idea vigorously without challenging the person who holds it. This ability, I'll call it contained disagreement, is perhaps the most sophisticated communication skill in the entire framework we've been building, because it requires holding two things simultaneously that feel mutually exclusive: genuine conviction about your own position, and genuine respect for the person who holds a different one. The research on productive disagreement comes from multiple traditions. Organizational psychologists have studied what they call psychological safety, a concept developed by Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmondson that describes the shared belief, within a team or relationship, that it is safe to take interpersonal risks, to speak up, to challenge, to admit error, to disagree. Edmondson's research found that psychological safety was the single strongest predictor of team performance across a wide range of industries and organizational structures, more predictive than individual talent, more predictive than resources, more predictive than any structural factor examined. Teams with high psychological safety outperformed their peers not because they agreed more, but because they disagreed better. They generated, examined, and refined more ideas because people felt safe enough to offer them without perfect certainty, to hear them challenged without collapsing, and to update their positions without losing status. What creates psychological safety in a disagreement is not the absence of challenge. It is the specific way challenge is delivered. The research identifies several consistent features of challenge that preserves rather than damages psychological safety. The challenge is directed at the idea rather than the person. I see this differently and here's why, rather than, you're missing something obvious. The challenge assumes good faith. It proceeds from the premise that the person holding the different position arrived there through reasonable means even if the conclusion is wrong. The challenge separates position from identity. It communicates that updating your position in response to new information is not defeat, but intelligence, and the challenge remains genuinely open to being challenged in return. It is offered not as a conclusion, but as a contribution to a shared investigation. That last feature is the one most often missing from disagreements that go badly. Most people who believe they are engaging in open-minded debate are neurologically and behaviorally primarily defending a conclusion they arrived at before the conversation started. The position has already been formed. The conversation is the territory in which it will be defended. Genuine openness to revision, the actual willingness to update your position if the other person offers something you hadn't considered, is rarer than we typically admit, and it is instantly recognizable when present. The person who listens to a challenge, to their position and says, genuinely, that's a point I hadn't fully weighted. Let me think about that, changes the entire character of the exchange. They transform it from combat into collaboration. There is a specific technique from the field of mediation that I have found consistently useful in helping people move from combat to collaboration in the middle of a disagreement. It is called steel manning, and it is the opposite of straw manning, where straw manning involves constructing the weakest possible version of the opposing position in order to defeat it. Steel manning involves constructing the strongest possible version, genuinely engaging with the best case for the other side before presenting your own. The strongest argument for your position, as I understand it, is X. Here's where I still think it falls short. That construction signals intellectual honesty, genuine engagement, and the kind of confidence that doesn't require the other position to be weak in order for yours to be strong. Disagreeing without destroying also requires a clear distinction between the content of the disagreement and the relationship within which it occurs. Every disagreement exists on two planes: the issue plane, where the actual content lives, and the relationship plane, where the trust, history, and mutual regard reside. Skillful communicators keep these planes separate. They can fight hard on the issue plane while protecting the relationship plane. Unskillful communicators conflate them. The disagreement becomes a referendum on the relationship. The challenge becomes a signal of disrespect. The failure to agree becomes evidence that something is fundamentally wrong between the people. Keeping the planes separate requires periodic, explicit signals that the relationship plane is safe even while the issue plane is heated. This can be as simple as a brief acknowledgement during an intense disagreement. I really value this conversation even when we're not landing in the same place, or at the end of one. I don't think we've resolved this and I still think I'm right, but I'm glad we talked. These signals are not weakness, and they are not manipulation. They are honest communications about the relationship that interrupt the conflation of argument with rejection. The goal of every disagreement handled well is not agreement. It is mutual understanding, followed by the best decision available given the perspectives in the room, and a relationship that is at least as strong at the end as it was at the beginning. That outcome is achievable. It requires skill, practice, and the fundamental commitment to treating the person across from you as a valued collaborator rather than an obstacle to be overcome. The long game of trust. Everything in this audiobook has been building toward a single destination that most conversations about conflict ignore entirely: the long-term architecture of trust. The techniques and skills we have covered, the pause, the empathic listening, the naming without blaming, the precise apology, the maintained limits, the willingness to disagree without destroying. These are not ends in themselves. They are the materials from which trust is constructed, conversation by conversation over time. Trust, as the research defines it, is a specific cognitive and emotional state that develops when three conditions are consistently met over time. competence, benevolence, and integrity. Competence means the other person can do what they say they can do. Benevolence means they are genuinely invested in your well-being, not just their own. Integrity means their behavior is consistent with their stated values, even, especially, under pressure. When all three are present and consistent, trust develops naturally. When any one of them is reliably absent, something else develops in its place, something that looks like a relationship from the outside but functions, on the inside, more like a managed transaction. What most people do not fully appreciate about trust is the asymmetry of its construction. Trust is built slowly, through accumulated small moments of consistency, kept commitments, honest communications, appropriate vulnerability, reliable presence in difficulty. It is destroyed quickly, through a single significant breach that retroactively reframes everything that preceded it. A year of reliable behavior followed by one major deception does not produce a net trust score slightly below perfect. It produces a question mark that sits over all the previous reliability. Was any of it real? The asymmetry is not fair. It is once again the brain's negativity bias operating at the level of relationship history, a bias toward threat-relevant information, a tendency to weight evidence of danger more heavily than evidence of safety. Understanding this asymmetry changes how you think about conflict in long-term relationships. Every difficult conversation is not just a problem to be solved. It is a trust event, an occasion on which your behavior either deposits into or withdraws from the trust account that the relationship is built on. The same conversation, handled with honesty and care, leaves both people feeling that the relationship can handle hard things. The same conversation, handled with defensiveness and manipulation, leaves a residue of doubt that may take months to clear. The stakes of any individual conversation are therefore higher and lower than they appear. Higher because each one shapes the ongoing construction of trust. Lower because no single conversation, unless catastrophically mishandled, is usually decisive. The researcher whose work has most shaped my thinking on trust in relationships is Brené Brown, whose extensive qualitative and quantitative research on vulnerability and connection produced one of the most practically useful frameworks for understanding how trust actually accumulates. Brown identifies what she calls the anatomy of trust using the acronym BRAVING, a framework that maps the specific behaviors that build trust in relationships: boundaries, honoring your own and others; reliability, doing what you say you'll do; accountability, owning your mistakes and making repairs; vault, maintaining confidentiality about what people share; integrity, choosing courage over comfort, practicing values rather than just professing them; non-judgment, receiving what others share without judgment; and generosity, extending the most generous interpretation to others' behavior and words. What strikes me most about this framework is how consistently the items on it are the behaviors most commonly abandoned under the pressure of conflict. Accountability, owning your mistakes, becomes minimization when the mistake is embarrassing. Reliability, doing what you say you'll do, becomes inconsistent when the promised change is difficult. Non-judgment, receiving what others share without judgment, becomes evaluation when what they share triggers your defensiveness. In other words, the behaviors that build trust are most available to us when we don't need them, and least available when we do. Conflict is precisely the conditions under which trust-building behavior is most tested and most costly. This is why the practices in this audiobook, the pause, the regulation, the empathic listening, are not just communication skills, they are trust infrastructure. Every time you manage your own reactivity rather than discharging it into a relationship, you make a deposit. Every time you apologize specifically and without conditions, you make a deposit. Every time you stay in a hard conversation rather than deflecting or withdrawing, you make a deposit. None of these deposits is individually large. Their cumulative effect over months and years in the full arc of a relationship is the difference between a relationship that feels safe and one that doesn't, between a partner or colleague or friend who trusts that you can handle hard things and one who manages their disclosure accordingly. There is one more dimension of trust worth addressing, and it is perhaps the most personal: trust in yourself. The capacity to navigate difficult conversations depends, at its foundation, on a quality of self-trust that has nothing to do with confidence in your communication skills. It is the trust that you can handle whatever comes up, that if you enter a hard conversation and it goes badly, you will survive it. That if someone responds with anger or disappointment or withdrawal, you will be able to stay present without collapsing. That if a relationship cannot withstand your honesty, the loss, however painful, will not undo you. Most avoidance in communication, the retreats, the deflections, the half-truths told to spare someone the full version, is ultimately self-protective, not protection of the relationship, protection of your own sense of safety and stability. The person who finally trusts themselves enough to be fully honest, not brutal, not weaponized, but fully honest, in difficult conversations, is the person who has made a quiet peace with the fact that honesty carries risk. Not the reckless embrace of risk, but the grounded acceptance of it, the knowledge that the risk is real and that you can hold it. That self-trust, built conversation by conversation through the practice of staying present in difficult moments, is the long game's real prize. Not perfect relationships, not conflict-free professional environments. The deep, earned, privately held knowledge that you can be trusted, by others and by yourself, to tell the truth when it costs something. That knowledge changes how you move through the world. It changes what you are available for. It changes the quality of every relationship you have. It is worth every hard conversation that builds it. The quietest victory. I want to take you back to a kitchen, not the one from the beginning, though that one started everything. A different kitchen years later. Same kind of argument in its early moments. The familiar heat, the familiar impulse to press the advantage, to make the case clearly enough that there could be no reasonable response left. I felt it the same way I always had. The old wiring was still there, but something different happened. I paused, not a dramatic pause. Nobody watching would have noticed. A breath, a moment of internal inventory. The quiet question, what is this person actually trying to tell me right now? And beneath the surface of what was being said, beneath the words that, taken at face value, looked like an attack, I could hear it. The fear that they weren't being heard. The need to know that their experience in this relationship was real and registered and valued. The exhaustion of someone who had been trying to communicate something important and kept feeling like it wasn't landing. I didn't win that conversation. I didn't lose it either. What I did, what I had finally, after years of practice and failure and more practice, become capable of doing, was stay in it, stay present, stay regulated, stay genuinely curious about what was happening for the person across from me, rather than focused on the case I was building in my own defense. I asked a question instead of making an argument. I acknowledged what I heard before I said what I thought. I named my own contribution before they had to name it for me. By the time we were done, nothing had been definitively resolved. The topic we'd been discussing was still complex, still without a clean answer, but the person across from me felt heard. I knew that because they said so, and because the quality of the conversation had shifted from combat to something that felt, and I am using this word precisely, like contact. The experience of two people actually reaching each other. That is the quietest victory. Not the argument won by the sharpest point. Not the debate ended by the most devastating rebuttal. The moment when a conversation that could have widened a distance instead closed one. When someone who came in defended left feeling understood. When you held both your own truth and the other person's reality in the same space at the same time, and neither one had to be destroyed for the other to exist. This is what social intelligence actually is. When you strip away the frameworks and the research and the techniques, it is the practiced capacity to remain human in the moments when everything in you wants to become a winning machine. To stay curious when you could be certain, to stay open when you could be closed, to choose, again and again, in the small conflicts and the large ones, in the kitchen and the conference room and the car and the phone call that starts badly and could end worse, to choose the person over the point. The work we've done in this audiobook has been, at its core, about one thing: expanding the space between what happens to you and what you do. Next, the pause, the breath, the internal question, the moment of translation that turns a difficult person's behavior into information instead of provocation. These are not tricks. They are practices, the same practices, applied consistently, that build the neural pathways of regulated response over time. They do not make conflict disappear. Nothing makes conflict disappear. They make you someone who can be present in conflict without being destroyed by it, and without destroying what you value in the attempt to survive it. The difficult people in your life will remain in many cases difficult. The avoided conversations will remain until you have them, waiting. The moments of escalation will come. The triggered response, the old wiring firing, the impulse to win at any cost. You will not be perfect at any of this. Neither am I. The goal is not perfection. The goal is a direction, the steady, practiced movement toward becoming someone who handles hard things with more skill and more care than you did before. Someone whose relationships are deeper because they can be honest. Someone whose conflicts are shorter because they begin from understanding rather than combat. Someone who can be trusted by others and by themselves in the moments that matter most. You walked into this audiobook carrying a version of yourself that had learned, through years of experience in biology and relationship history, a particular way of moving through conflict. Some of that learning served you. Some of it didn't. Some of it was never really yours. It was handed to you by a nervous system shaped before you had any say in the matter, by environments that taught you what you needed to do to survive. You do not have to keep every piece of that inheritance. The loudest room, as I said at the beginning, was always the one inside my own head, learning to quiet it, not to silence it, not to pretend the old wiring isn't there, but to find the pause within it, the breath, the question, the choice. That has been the work of years. It is ongoing. It will always be ongoing. There is no arrival point where you are done becoming someone who communicates with skill and integrity and genuine care, but there are moments, quiet, unremarkable, not visible to anyone watching, when you catch yourself in the old pattern and choose differently, when the argument you were about to win becomes the question you ask instead, when the counterattack you were building becomes the acknowledgement you offer instead, when the distance you were about to widen becomes by one small deliberate choice, a little smaller. Those moments do not feel like victory. They feel like almost nothing. They feel like a breath, like a pause, like the quietest possible decision made in the loudest possible moment. They are everything.